What's up, folks? Welcome back to TacticalTortoise. My name is Trevi, and welcome to another installment of the best armies in Warhammer 40k, the weekly video series, where we go through competitive events from the weekend past and break down competitive winning lists from each faction that went undefeated. And this week was one of the biggest weekends that we've seen in basically all of 10th edition Warhammer 40k, with multiple major and super major level events going down, including events like FLG's Cherokee Open and the Schwenenklappen Open, all of which generated multiple undefeated players and undefeated lists, and gave us what is a good holistic view of what the metagame is going to look like post the January balanced data slate, which made an enormous transformative change to Warhammer 40k's metagame. So let's dive in and talk about what went undefeated and what had a good weekend with a metagame breakdown. Now, we're going to start with our new Lords and Saviors. Necron, who put a massive 7 players undefeated between 2 from both the Games of Westeros 17 and Broadsword Wargaming GTs, 1 from the HWP Salty Classic, 1 from the Schwenenklappen Open, and 1 from Brewhammer GT5. Following that up, we had a resurgence of chaos list with a ton of different factions putting 2 players into an undefeated record. This included Thousand Sons, a faction that we haven't seen at the top table in a little while, and did see a few debuffs in the January data slate, which took down Game Night GT as well as winning the Cherokee Open. Although, well, technically that wasn't an undefeated record. They did win the top cut and were the first place player out of about 250 players at that event. So we will be talking about that list this week. Death Guard also put 2 players undefeated at the Game Night GT and Schwenenklappen Open. Space Marines also saw a fairly good weekend with 2 separate chapters going undefeated. Ultramarines with a standard Vanguard spearhead that we're probably not going to talk about because we've talked about similar lists in many weeks previously at the Heroes of Mid-Table's Winter GT, as well as Space Wolves going undefeated at the NorCal Open GT. Tau Empire also had a fairly good weekend, a little bit surprising, not only at the Schwenenklappen Open, but also at the Dice Arcade GT2. We also saw Grey Knights taking down the Milwaukee GT, as well as another undefeated result at the Dice Arcade GT2. And a bunch of singleton armies with only a single undefeated this weekend, including Aeldari at GeekFest, Chaos Knights at the Alliance Open 40k Masters, another appearance from the Milwaukee GT, this time of Astra Militarum, the winner of the Schwenenklappen Open, Malchahofs or Votann, who we've seen streamed on this channel before, winning with Chaos Space Marines, and last but certainly not least, at the Austrian Open, Leagues of Votann. So as we can see, while we do see a predominance of Necrons currently in the metagame, and primarily Hypercrypt Legion, we're also seeing an enormous breadth and diversity of other armies going undefeated. Now, while the number of events that we have this week is quite a few, there aren't really enough to see every army in the game go undefeated, and that's not a realistic thing to ask for, but we are seeing most of them either going undefeated, and I believe every single army saw at least 1 player being put into an X-1 record, which is an enormous achievement for this balanced data slate, and makes 10th edition 40k so far look incredibly interesting and incredibly balanced. Now, interestingly, there are some things missing from this week that I think otherwise we would be expecting to see. Adeptus Custodes being one of them. Those guys have really not shown up since they did extremely well last week. Whether or not that's a trend we continue to see and whether Necrons continue their domination, that's going to be an interesting question looking on into the future. But now, let's dive into some lists, and we will start by talking about those Necrons. Now, at the Games of Westeros 17, we saw 2 Necron players go undefeated. This event was really dominated by Necrons. Both this and Broadsword Wargaming had a very similar undefeated makeup because they were both taken over by Necrons. Today we're going to be talking about the second place placer in that event, Kali Abrahamson, who went 5-0 with a Hypercrypt Legion list. Now, we have seen Hypercrypt Legion kind of follow the trend of the Las Vegas Open winning list run by Matt Laura, running a Monolith and Immortals and a lot of infantry to make use of the Monolith. However, the lists at this event did not really follow that trend, and I think it goes to show that Hypercrypt Legion is actually a very flexible detachment. We can see a lot of different army builds arise out of it. This one in particular was running a single Catan Shard, the Catan Shard of the Nightbringer, alongside a Chronomancer with a Risen Tyrant, 2 Hexmark Destroyers, one of which with Dimensional Overseer, and a standard Transcendent Catan. The benefit of the normal Transcendent Catan is that not only can it re-deep strike itself by advancing without the need to actually Hypercrypt Legion detachment ability, so it doesn't necessarily put strain on the number of models that you are putting into that Hypercrypt strategic reserve, but the Transcendent Catan also has deep strike on its datasheet, meaning that unlike the Catan shard of the Nightbringer, it actually can deep strike and use the Hypercrypt hyperphasing on turn 1 to deploy the end of the opponent's turn on the first battle round and then jump back in immediately in your next reinforcement step. So while it is less powerful than the character Catan shards, it is much more maneuverable and great at scoring points. We then saw a single unit of Immortals, 2 units of Death Marks to make up the battle line, alongside a ton of mounted units and heavy guns. This included 3 individual Locust Destroyers and 3 units of 3 Locust Heavy Destroyers, 2 units of 3 Gauss Destructors, 1 unit of 2 Within-Mitic Exterminators. Following that up was a unit of Tomb Blades for a little bit of early game secondary objective scoring with their long scout move, and 2 Doomsday Arcs. And I absolutely love the inclusion of Doomsday Arcs and big heavy guns like those Locust Destroyers in styles of lists like Hypercrypt Legion, because what they allow you to do is get incredibly easy lines of sight on your opponent. It's almost impossible to hide from a Hypercrypt Legion list that wants to get shots on with either those Heavy Destroyers or the Doomsday Arcs, since those units are going to be coming out of reserve Cosmic Precision to jump into the middle of the table and really get angles wherever they want. Now moving on from that, we'll talk about the winning list of the Cherokee Open. This was won by Thousand Sun. Noah Neuendorfer went undefeated with a Thousand Suns Cult of Magic. This included Ahriman, Magnus the Red, an Exalted Sorcerer with the Umberlific Crystal to allow his unit to be downy once per game, alongside 2 Exalted Sorcerers on Discs of Tzeentch, one of them taking Lord of Forbidden Lore to allow him to replicate Kabbalistic rituals that had already been cast. That's extremely prevalent on the Disc of Tzeentch Exalted Sorcerers, since those guys are relatively hardy by themselves. They have a 4+ invulnerable save, as well as 6 wounds and access to Thousand Sun's ability to reroll saves or auto-pass failed saves in order to keep them alive, but that also gives him a base movement of 12, and he is somehow infantry despite riding on a surfboard, which allows him to move through walls and act as a very maneuverable applicator of those duplicated rituals. We then had an Infernal Master with Arcane Vortex to buff his damage, 3 units of Rubric Marines, 2 units of 10, and 1 unit of 5, as well as 2 units of Zangors. The Zangors are a wild inclusion. They do give you the ability to generate additional Cabal points. They also just act as a pretty solid utility unit. They're not the easiest thing in the world to kill, and they're okay in melee, especially against other chaff infantry. But I think part of the inclusion here was that they're kind of a meme, because in BCP this list was titled, "If I get on Goonhammer with Zangors, it will be hilarious," which, to be fair, it kind of is. A lot of times you would take Thousand Suns cultists in the Zangors' place. They have Scout, they give you CP back, but in this case we elected to go with Zangors for the style points. We then also had 2 units of 2 Thousand Suns Chaos Spawn to act as utility, as well as a Mutalith Vortex Beast, not only to extend the range of those Kabbalistic rituals, but also to act as a good gun platform and just a survivable piece to hang out in the middle of the table. The interesting thing about this Thousand Suns list is not only does it include Zangors, absolutely wild, but it is also including lots of large Rubric Marine squads. 2 units of 10 Rubric Marines for potentially Ahriman and the Umberlific Crystal Exalted Sorcerer to join into to allow them to reposition around the table is really interesting and represents a ton of damage from those 2 units. The downside, obviously, of Rubric Marines is their expense and the fact that they're relatively easy to kill, but if we're not expecting to see too much artillery or indirect fire that can kill them before they commit and actually do their damage, those big Rubric Marine squads can absolutely hit for a ton of damage, especially against heavy infantry lists and lists that are relying on big stompy monsters and robots. If we expect to see things like Custodes, for example, that did really well last week, those big Rubric Marine squads are actually going to give Custodian Guard a run for their money when it comes to surviving in the middle of the table and hold down objectives. And that brings us on to another of the Chaos sub-factions. We can talk about Death Guard. Now, Death Guard actually did pretty well in hand with Thousand Suns at the Game Night GT, where both of the sub-factions went 5-0. And today we're going to be talking about Jacob Cluey's list from that same GT. This was a plague company led by none other than Mortarion. Mortarion's got a little bit of a buff in the last Data Slate update with his newfound ability to ignore all weapon characteristic modifiers in addition to roll modifiers and other characteristic modifiers. This means effects like Armor of Contempt or Damage Reduction actually has no effect on units affected by Mortarion's aura. We also have a Lord of Virulence in that character slot alongside Typhus, a newly discounted character who is absolutely insane for his ability to do tons of mortal wound, just generally generally be kind of a beat stick for only 80 points. Typhus is an absolute steal. I think you would take him in basically every list of almost any faction that had access to him. We then had a ton of Plague Marines in order to make up the battle line, 4 units of 5 Plague Marine embarking into Death Guard Rhinos with 2 units of Death Shroud Terminators to attach those Terminator characters into. Those are 3 Death Shroud Terminators apiece and benefit pretty heavily from attaching both Typhus and the Lord of Virulence. Both Typhus and the Lord of Virulence have a lot of synergy with those units. The Lord of Virulence gives reroll wound rolls to the Death Shroud Terminators with their ranged attacks, meaning that their little auto-hitting torrent flamers are going to be relatively effective with those wound rerolls. Typhus also can impose a -1 to hit penalty on the unit that he's attached into, which can stack alongside the -1 weapon skill or ballistic skill contagion that Death Guard are able to infect themselves with, giving them essentially -2 to be hit, making a lot of armies unable to kill them. With their own ability to get -1 to be wounded if your strength is higher than their toughness, when they have an attached character inside the unit, that means that Typhus' unit could potentially be -2 to hit and -1 to wound when in melee, which is just a ludicrous profile to try to get into. And if you don't kill him, he's going to hit you back Big Man Reaper, as well as in his shooting phase, a ton of mortals back into you, which you definitely want to get rid of as soon as possible. We're then seeing a return to the faction's old archetype of taking a bunch of artillery and heavy vehicles, including 2 Fetid Bloat Drones and 3 Plague Burst Crawlers. Those guys are going to be benefiting immensely from Mortarian's Ignore Penalties aura, because they're able to fire their Plague Burst Mortars indirectly without getting the -1 to hit from firing indirect fire that you would normally suffer from, since he allows them to ignore roll modifiers. Last but certainly not least, we just had 1 unit of 3 Nurglings to act as utility, and that was the entirety of the list. A big departure from the classic list that we've seen in the previous season, taking tons of Plague Marines and buffing them up with Plague Marine characters. Instead, we're seeing more of an emphasis on Mortarion and on those Death Shroud Terminator units with incredibly effective Terminator characters. Now, keeping with the power armor theme, we can also talk about Loyalist Space Marines, who put 2 lists undefeated, one with Ultramarines and one with Space Wolves. We're not going to talk about the Ultramarines list right now because it was a relatively standard Vanguard Spearhead that we've talked about previously. However, we will talk about Forest Phantom's Space Wolf list that won the NorCal Open. This list was running a Stormlance task force, and like many of the Stormlance task forces that we've seen from Space Wolves previously, it does focus on their incredible cavalry option, the Thunderwolf Cavalry. The list is bringing Herald Deathwolf, Logan Grimnar on Storm Rider, as well as a Wolflord on Thunderwolf with Fury of the Storm. Those guys all attaching into units alongside Wolfguard Battle Leaders and Thunderwolves. We then had 3 units of 6 Thunderwolf Cavalry to attach those models into, meaning that we are going to be creating a bank of 24 cavalry models, all attached into enormous, disgusting units. These guys can then get -1 to hit and wound from the defensive Stormlance stratagem. They can also advance and charge innately thanks to the detachment ability, auto 6 their advances potentially, and just do absolutely immense damage. But that's not all in the list. Interestingly, we do have a lot of really interesting additional inclusions that can help support that Thunderwolf focused game plan. That included a Librarian and Phobos armor attached into a unit of 5 infiltrators to make it difficult to not only infiltrate onto the army, but also deep strike next to it, since you're getting a 6 model unit that all gets the Omni Scrambler effect, and because of the attached Librarian, cannot be attacked from outside 12 inches, meaning that most deep striking armies have no way to actually interact with that infiltrator squad, meaning it can screen its backline or even screen in front of the Thunderwolf cavalry bricks and allow you to prevent enemies movement blocking them or screening your rapid ingresses really effectively. We then also had a Calidus Assassin and 2 Scout Squads to add some additional utility, but last but certainly not least, a ton of melee infantry in the form of Wolfen. The army was bringing 25 Wolfen with their newfound 2 damage Wolfen hammers, those being 2 units of 10 and 1 unit of 5. While Wolfen are absolutely horrible at holding down objectives or acting as utility because they are OC0 and can't take objectives themselves, they, for only 16 points a model, bring a relatively difficult to kill profile, as well as having a very strong melee profile. They can act as kind of just a cheap trading unit that can kill basically any similar medium infantry in the game for much less than those medium infantry are worth. And there's a pretty significant chance that on the swing back, they don't even die, since they're protecting a relatively high toughness value with a 4+ invulnerable save. Wolfen went from being 0 to hero in that last update, and they are looking incredibly good, not only in Stormlands task forces, but we also see them in Gladius task forces and other similar Space Wolf lists across the board. Now, moving on to the last of the power armored factions that we're going to be talking about that have multiple undefeated results today, we can talk about Grey Knights, which was able to take down both the Dice Arcade GT2 as well as the Milwaukee GT. Now, that Dice Arcade GT2 is the one we're going to be talking about today, where Greg McGinnity went 5-0 with a relatively heavily Nemesis Dread Knight focused Grey Knights list. This list was rocking a Brother Captain with the Sigil of Exigence as well as a Brotherhood Librarian as its infantry characters. We had a 10-man Terminator squad to attach that Brother Captain into, giving us an excellent outlet for that unit to teleport around the table when targeted by range attacks thanks to that Sigil of Exigence. The Brotherhood Librarian was then just by himself. He can jump in and just act as a utility unit while also plowing people for tons of mortal wounds thanks to his Vortex of Doom. Last but not least, we also had a Grandmaster in Nemesis Dread Knight with a charge bonus thanks to Inescapable Wrath. Following that up in the battle line, we had 2 units of 5 strikes, as well as a bunch of interceptors. 2 units of 5 interceptors to act as utility for their ability to shoot and then move, meaning that they are very difficult to screen out from stealing objectives or getting into table quarters because they can jump outside 9 inches of you with their teleport strike thanks to the Grey Knight's army ability, then shoot their bolters and move in closer. We then also had a unit of servitors to act as utility as well, and 3 Nemesis Dread Knights. That made for a total of 4 Nemesis Dread Knights in the army, and gives the army pretty reasonable shooting. The new buffs to the heavy psi cannon makes it much scarier when shooting into a wide variety of enemies. Now, with it being a higher AP and ignoring cover, it's actually able to punch through some pretty reasonable armor saves. With a relatively high volume, high damage gun, that means that they can really threaten heavy infantry and even vehicles. And with 4 heavy psi cannons in the list, can actually take down some pretty hard targets with all of their powers combined. With the Nemesis Dread Knight's ability to advance and charge, they're very good at rapid ingressing into annoying plot spaces in the table in order to get themselves into a position to advance and get into a melee position in the next turn. It's also difficult to hide from them with, again, that ability to both teleport and also advance and shoot their guns as normal. That gives the list incredible flexibility, a little bit of a different defensive profile than Grey Knights have been used to before, where they were almost entirely Terminators previously, and also some pretty reasonable shooting, which the faction has not really enjoyed since the edition began. And with that, we'll move on to the last faction that had multiple undefeated lists, that being Tau Empire. Now, we're going to stay on the Dice Arcade GT2 because the other undefeated list there was Cooper Fitzgerald taking the Tau Empire. This was a very commander-focused list, using the newfound discounted points values of Crisis Commanders and Enforcer Commanders to be able to take a ton of them in an army. This list was led by a Cold Star Commander battlesuit with Exemplar of the Cao Yan. He was joined into a Big Brick Crisis battlesuits, but those were the only leaderable Crisis battlesuits that we had in the army. We then had 2 individual Crisis Commanders with Cyclic Ion Blasters alongside an Enforcer Commander, also with Cyclic Ion Blasters. No enhancements on those 3. That was followed up by Darkstrider, who was attached into a unit of Pathfinders, alongside 3 Breacher teams, 2 of which could embark into 2 of the army's Devilfish, following that up with some solid support from Tetras and 3 Riptide battlesuits. This army taking as much advantage as it could of the new points cuts that had been laid on Tau in the last update. That gave the list a pretty reasonable number of pretty effective utility units. The Crisis Commanders could drop in, clear out enemy chaff, and even just perform actions themselves, while the Cold Star Commander can act as a support for the Crisis Battlesuit team. We then had the Riptide Battlesuits as just big, tanky monsters that can stand in the middle of the table, do pretty reasonable damage with their shooting, but also be incredibly difficult to kill for their 165 point cost. Now, Tau Empire wasn't the only Xenos army to see some success this weekend, because we also saw Aeldari return like a Phoenix Lord from the ashes to win a GT, even after the multiple rounds of nerfs the faction has received. This was Jonathan Betteridge at GeekFest GT, going 5-0 with his battle host. Now, I've actually streamed a lot of Jonathan's games over on Tabletop Simulator. You can find a lot of them over on my other channel. If I remember, I'll put a link in the video to some of his gameplay running lists similar to the one that he played at GeekFest. But Jonathan is an absolutely incredible Aeldari player and showcases what you can do with the army when not focusing on just the standard builds. And also, I think showcases how flexible the faction is even after its normal archetypes have been nerfed. Jonathan Jonathan was running an Autarch Wayleaper with the Phoenix Gem to regenerate him on death, a Death Jester with Fate's Messenger, now that it only works on the character itself, not the character's unit. The Death Jester is really the natural place for that enhancement. We also had an Avatar of Cain, a standard Farseer, as well as Fuigen the Firelord. Following that up, we had a ton of utility, including 2 units of 5 Swooping Hawks, a unit of 5 Warp Spiders, and a unit of 5 Rangers, all of which are either maneuverable or forward operators and just good for holding down points and scoring objectives. We also then had 2 units of 3 Shroud Runners, again, good forward operators that are fast and can hold objectives and can also do some infantry sweeping and buff the rest of the army by themselves. Those were supporting 2 support weapon platforms with D cannons to add a little bit of anti-tank shooting to the army, and all of that together was backed up by a Scathach Wraith Knight. That's right, everybody, you thought that the days of the Wraith Knight was over with the first couple nerfs to Aeldari, but you were wrong. The Scathach Wraith Knight is still here to play, and if you haven't seen this guy on the table, it is an absolute trip. This thing has the classic Wraith Knight profile, a toughness 12 with a 2+ save and 18 wounds. Jonathan's was equipped with 2 Inferno Lances. These are each 4-shot, strength 12, AP 4, D6 Melta 2 weapons, giving it a total of 8 really heavy anti-tank weapons. Now, the Scathach Wraith Knight itself has a built-in Deep Strike, which means he's actually able to get those weapons on target pretty effectively within the Melta range of the weapon at 12 inches in order to benefit from that additional bonus damage. In addition, it also is equipped with a Webway Shunt Generator, which allows you to uppy downy it, jump it back into reserve at the end of your opponent's turn, and then place it into strategic reserves and deep strike it back on the table in a future turn once per game. That allows it to potentially start in reserve, deep strike in, blow something up, and if your opponent's not able to kill it, which is oftentimes kind of hard, it can then turn around and jump up and dive again on another very valuable unit and kill most of the enemy units that are capable of killing it. With all the forward operators in the list, like those Rangers and like those Shroud Runners, they're able to move forward aggressively and clear out enemy screening units, allowing the Scathach Wraith Knight to do its thing with impunity, not having to worry about enemy forward operators moving forward and screening it out from where it wants to be dropping. The Farseer in the list can also keep it alive in early turns by giving it Fortune for -1 to be wounded. The turn that the Scathach Wraith Knight wants to commit, you can also expose the Avatar of Cain and really threat overload your opponent, putting both these big, huge Titanic units into a very aggressive position where they're going to have to deal with both of them or get hit by one of them, and whichever one they don't deal with is probably going to do enough damage, especially alongside the other shooting available in the army, to put the Eldar in a good position game. Super interesting list, and definitely a cool inclusion from Jonathan to be taking these big, huge, stompy monster boys. Definitely a lot less degenerate than the previous Wraith Knights that were running with their infinite fate dice and phantasm and devastating wounds converting into mortals, but still an incredibly strong option. Now with that, we'll move on to some other lists. In no particular order, we have Chaos Knight winning the Alliance Open 40k Masters, where Dick Vanderharst went undefeated with the faction. This is a relatively standard brand of War Dog spam Chaos Knight. We do see Nurglings return into the build even after they got their recent points hike. We also see Brigands as not necessarily the majority of the army, but making up the backbone of the army again even after their recent points hike. This list is built up of a single War Dog Stalker to act as the Warlord, no enhancements on him this time around to free up additional room for more War Dogs. We then had 5 War Dog Brigands, 6 War Dog Carnivores for a total of 12 War Dogs, and 4 units of Nurglings to act as utility. Not too much to say here. Pretty standard variety of Chaos Knights. We've been seeing this army since the beginning of the edition. It's always been fairly strong, and it, I think, will continue to do so. As long as a big T10 spam with a bunch of really solid range profiles is going to be good, which I imagine it will be, then we'll probably see this list pop up here and there, and we're seeing it today. Now, Astra Militarum also went undefeated at the Milwaukee GT alongside Grey Knights. They were piloted this time around by Derek Glassman, who is running Lord Solar Leontius, a platoon command squad alongside Ursula Creed and 2 tank commanders. We can put Lord Solar Leontius alongside the platoon command squad into a single infantry unit, at this time being a Death Corps of Kriegs unit. That allows Lord Solar to use the unit's attached mortar as well as their Master Vox to broadcast his orders over a greater distance. The mortar can then sit next to Ursula Creed, and she can allow it to get overlapping fields of fire free, letting you get +1 AP on whatever the mortar shoots at that, assuming that it hits. We then also have a Basilisk, 2 6-man Bulgrin squads, 2 Cyclops demolition vehicles to act as utility, alongside 3 units of Khazarkin as just early game absolute powerhouses. They're able to scout move early on in the game, get themselves orders from their own Warrior Elite special rule, and really trade up against enemy units early on in the game, allowing the Bulgrin to actually survive in the center of the table without being just beaten down by more effective enemy units before the guard player is able to saturate the enemy deployment zone with high explosives. Speaking of high explosives, we also had 2 Manticores alongside 2 Scout Sentinels. This is a very classic brand of Astra Militarum. The faction's really been boiled down to essentially a fine point right now. This list is very effective and very scary, but it is basically the sum total of competitive lists that we've been seeing from Astra Militarum recently. Chaos Space Marines, like Aeldari, is also returning to the undefeated seat at the Schoenenklappen Open, with Malcha taking them to an undefeated record and actually winning the entire event, being the top placing out of 4 undefeated players at the end of the weekend. Malcha was running Abaddon the Despoiler, the Great Man himself, alongside 2 undivided Chaos Lords. Both of those Chaos Lords had units of 5 undivided chosen to jump into, as well as an undivided Chaos Rhino that they could all embark into. Basically, the classic Chaos Lords plus chosen wombo combo that we've been seeing for basically the entirety of the edition so far. Nothing really new here, but we do see some other new inclusions, specifically in the form of Chaos Bikers, which act as incredible utility, with their ability to outmaneuver and jump into strategic reserve if wholly within 6 inches of a battlefield edge. That lets them screen effectively in the early game, jump into reserve, and then pop back out to complete action secondaries or maneuver secondaries. But they're also just good at holding down objectives. They have Mark of Nurgle, so they benefit from Dark Obscuration, and aren't too bad at actually dealing damage themselves, with access to Dark Pacts, a Power Fist on the Sergeant, as well as a couple Meltagons on the Special Weapon Bikers. We then had a lot of Chaos Armor, including a Forge Fiend, 2 Nurgle Chaos Vindicators, as well as a Nurgle Predator Destructor, to be the real ranged element of the army, alongside 2 units of Warp Talons, with Mark of Slanesh to give them access to Advance and Charge, to jump up the table, steal enemy objectives, and clear away enemy chaff. With the massive nerfs to Accursed Cultists, we're seeing Chaos Space Marine lists boil down into much more heavily armored and lethal builds that are focused on getting the most out of their Dark Pacts and winning shootouts with enemy ranged armies by use of Dark Obscuration on those big heavy units like Vindicator. That can let them play much more aggressively than other gunline armies, and with their ability to get bonuses thanks to Dark Pacts, they can also usually outshoot most stuff of a similar weight class. That certainly helps them overcome the downsides that they suffered with their recent nerf, but clearly they still have enough of their classic damage output to remain competitive in the new 2024 season. And that brings us to the last army of the weekend that we're going to be talking about, this one from the Austrian Open, where Peter Steiner went undefeated with his Oathband. Like a lot of the lists that we've talked about this week, this list is kind of a return to form, actually, of old school varieties of Leagues of Votann that we see some play before their most recent update. This list was running 2 Einherjar champions, one of which with Appraising Glare, as well as a Call with Grim Demeanor. We had 2 units of Hearthkin Warriors and 5 Sagittor. 2 of those were going to be carrying Chthonian Berserks, and all of that was in support of 15 Hernkin Pioneers, 2 units of 6 and 1 unit of 3, as well as a unit of Einherjar Hearthguard. So with the ability to split the Hearthkin Warriors into multiple units, we can, alongside those and the Chthonian Berserks, fill up all 5 Sagittors. That gives us a grand total of 8 scouting units. You can push 15 Hernkin Pioneers as well as all 6 Sagittors right up the middle of the table. If your opponent is not able to answer that level of aggression, and to be honest, very few opponents are, you're going to force them into their deployment zone, lock them in there, prevent them from scoring, probably do a pretty reasonable amount of damage as well, and give yourself an enormous advantage in the early game. You can then use the 10-man unit of Einherjar Hearthguard as well to deep strike in behind those scouts, since it's going to be difficult to screen them out, and they can then close out the game for the list. Lists like these are incredibly dominant going first. They're a little bit less powerful going second, but the list has enough speed and abuse of the transport mechanics to still work regardless. That said, the recent increases in points value of the Einherjar Hearthguard and Sagittors does make it a lot tougher, since this list does go up a lot in points. But obviously, Peter is showcasing that a variety of lists like this is still strong even after those recent nerfs. And with that, those are all of the best armies in Warhammer 40k for this week. week. Let me know down in the comment section which one was your favorite and what you think about how the metagame is shaping up after the January 2024 update. Things are looking absolutely insane for Warhammer 40k right now, and I couldn't be more excited for it. Big thanks for watching all the way to the end of the video. Thanks as well to everybody who supports the channel, either over on Patreon, patreon.com/TacticalTortoise, YouTube channel members, and Twitch subscribers. All you people are amazing, and I love you. You help me keep doing what I do over here and talk Warhammer directly into your ear holes every week. Remember to keep it classy, folks, and have happy wargaming.